Welcome back, and today we are going to be talking about the edge split modifier and how to use it for 3D printing. So let's go ahead and do a new general project if you're just opening, and let's save it as, and we can just call it edge split. So to begin, I'm just going to turn off this icosphere and Suzanne. We'll come back to those in a little bit, but I want to just show you the edge split at its most basic form. So edge split is really seems to be mainly for like animation or rendering to make your edges a little softer or harder sometimes, but for 3D printing it's a little trickier. So first let's turn off this modifier, and I'm going to show you what the edge split is doing. So say if we go into edit mode, so just take a cube into edit mode, and let's say we went to our edges and grab some edges like this, and then we could go to mesh, split, and we could split the selection like that, and split off a piece of our geometry. That is a very destructive workflow. So what we can do is just delete that cube, and let's add a new cube, which is just mesh cube, and let's use the edge split modifier. So it's going to do a very similar thing to what we just did, but in a modifier form, and that way it's you can turn it on and off if you need to change the angle, or you can turn on sharp edges to get very specific on which edges you want to split off. And it's kind of hard to see what is happening here. So right now, technically, since we have the angles turned on, if we were to go into edit mode and grab one of the points, notice everything's still connected. But if we were to apply this and go into edit mode, notice now everything's been duplicated on top of itself, and we've got all of our edges have been split. So you would have to apply that to see that happen, but you can also use it in tandem with the 3D print toolbox and some other modifiers to get some pretty cool effects. So if you just have edge split on with your angles, that will split everything into separate pieces. But let's say we added a solidify modifier, maybe like a millimeter, like 1 millimeter. Notice here we've already got some kind of lines happening right now. Maybe we take that to 1, and so what this is doing is it's telling Blender, hey, I want you to split every single edge into its own separate face and then make it solid, add some thickness to it. So that's essentially what this is. And if we 3D printed it, it would 3D print all of these faces out individually. Let's go ahead and export that out just to show you. So let's go ahead and tell Blender where we want to save and then do export. So if we bring in our cube, notice we've got all the different pieces here. And if we slice it up and scrub through it, notice that none of the edges are touching. So you may want to do that for some design. I'm not sure why you would want to do it, but this is how you could do it. So now we've just taken every single face and split it up. And if you're in Simplify 3D, you can actually go to Mesh, Separate Connected, and then rearrange them and get all the different parts kind of laid out, individually. So that's pretty cool. Another thing we can do is select the top of our box here, and if we go into edge, we can mark it sharp, and notice that there's kind of like a little blue line that has appeared on the edges that we just highlighted and made sharp. So that's how you can tell that they are marked sharp. And if we go into our edge split and go into object mode, we can turn off the angle, but if we check sharp edges, it's only going to split the blue edges, the ones that we tell Blender specifically. So let's say if we added a solidify modifier and maybe 1 millimeter, you can see the lines happening here, and maybe positive offset of 1. And there you go. So now we've got essentially a lid and a little box. And so if we exported that and then bring that into our slicer, notice now we have a little box that we made. So it'll print the the shell of it and then the little top. And again, if you bring it into Simplify 3D, you can separate the mesh and rearrange, and that will give you the separate pieces that you could then 3D print. And I'm not sure how to do this in Prusa Slicer, because if you right click and split to objects, It does split into two parts, but it just separates the inner shell from the outer shell. So it's not really giving us the effect that we want here. So you would have to do the separation in Simplify 3D, or just go in and manually separate these two objects. Another thing you could do is, let's turn on our icosphere, or just create Shift A and create an icosphere, maybe about 10 or 20 millimeters. And so with our new icosphere, we can add an edge split, and I'm also going to add a solidify modifier just so you can kind of see what's happening. And maybe we crank it up to 5 and maybe 1 for that. So notice that when I added the solidify and cranked it up, it just made the icosphere thicker, and that's because of the angle. Since this is more of a sphere shape, we're going to have to drop the angle, and notice what happens as we drop the angle to 0. So you can kind of see as I'm dropping it down, it's actually splitting apart all the angles, all the faces here. So that's a pretty cool way to just quickly kind of show you what's happening with the edge split modifier. It is literally splitting all these edges, and then it will then add the solidify to make this really cool shape. So I mean, this by itself looks pretty awesome. Let's say if we had it at like 1 millimeter thickness, and even at like 0 or -1, sometimes what I'll do is, instead of -1, do like -0.9, and that will give you enough tolerances to where your object can be put back together, but will also break apart into multiple pieces. So let me go ahead and show you what I mean by that. So let's just take your icosphere, and then we should have your same folder, and just hit export. And so if we bring our object into a slicer, you can kind of see there's very, very tiny little gaps. But if we slice it, they're actually so close together that Prusa will just melt them together. But if we right click it and do split to objects, it will actually break apart all of the little pieces individually. You can see we have a ton of pieces here, we have 80 different pieces that we can arrange. And there we go. We've got all of our pieces of our icosphere laid out, and they will all perfectly piece back together. I don't know who would want to piece an icosphere together, but maybe you want to make like a puzzle or some kind of cool project where you need everything to break apart. This is how you could do it. And if we did the same thing in Simplify 3D and we bring in the icosphere, you can still see the little offset cracks inside in between each of these faces. But if we prepare for print in Simplify 3D, it's actually going to print these as separated materials. So Prusa will kind of melt them together, and Simplify 3D notices that they are all separate. So depending on what slicer you have, you may be able to do this in Prusa Slicer. Maybe I have a setting that needs to be changed, but that's the way you can break apart objects in those two different slicers with the edge split modifier. Another thing that you can do with the edge split modifier, let's just turn on the Suzanne. And what I did for this one is just made kind of like a little box top here. You can kind of see the top of her head where it's indented right here. And all I did for that is just go into edit mode, and let's turn off the solidify here for a second. And I just highlighted these edges like this, and just clicked on, just shift click on all the little edges you want, and went to edge and mark sharp. And then on the edge split, instead of using angle, I just have sharp edges, and then added the solidify at 1 millimeter thickness and the offset of 0. And that way, if you export that out, it'll kind of make like a little top that will fit, say if you wanted to make like a little piggy bank or something. So let's bring in Suzanne, and you can see here the little indentation that we made with the edge slice. And again, Prusa is going to just blur that together. You can kind of see the little indentation there. It's trying. And you could also right click, split to objects, and there you go. You've got a little hollow monkey with a separate little skull piece. So that's something you could do in Prusa. So those are the main ways that I've learned how to use the edge split modifier. I wouldn't really use it that often. I feel like there's better ways to do some of the separation of certain objects. I like to have my objects, if this was going to be a separate piece, then I would like it to be a separate piece over here. But maybe this helps you with something that you're trying to do, or just sparks some ideas, or maybe gives you a new design thought, or sparks something inside of you that makes you want to split some edges non-destructively. So let's go ahead and jump into the next lesson.